Jesus is preaching today. I hope we always hear Jesus in the Word, but in Luke chapter 21, we find a sermon, or at least a summary. I don't think Jesus always preached this short, but a summary of a sermon, we've categorized it that he presented in the temple. This is near the end of his earthly ministry prior to his crucifixion and resurrection. But the chapter doesn't begin with the sermon. It begins with Jesus and his closest disciples doing some observation. They were at the temple, and chapter 21 begins with the little story we tell our children, maybe without unpacking it fully, about the poor widow who gave an offering. And Jesus categorized that offering as the greatest offering, at least of that day. They had watched many wealthy people tossing their offerings, apparently with great show, and then this widow placing 2 small coins. And Jesus said to his disciples, "This poor widow has put in more than all the others." All the others gave their gifts out of their wealth. She, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. And then they moved from that place, and as they moved around the temple, there was conversation, maybe not just among the disciples, but some of the bystanders as well. The conversation involved the splendor and majesty of the temple, and it was majestic from every report. Not only was it majestic, but the size of the stones, some of the foundation stones that still sit there today are almost as large as small automobiles. And looking at the size and the splendor of the temple, there was a sense, obviously, among the crowd that this was a permanent structure, that the Jews would always have this temple as the heart place of their worship. Jesus, listening to those comments, began his sermon with a prophecy. He said in 21:6, "As for these things that you see," obviously pointing to the stones, "the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." Now, this is Jesus' third prediction of the temple's destruction. We find back in, or at least in Luke, we find in Luke chapter 13 and again in 19, we see this one. There will be a later one in this same chapter in verses 20 through 24. And then in chapter 23, as he is on his way to be crucified, he makes yet another prediction of the destruction of the temple. In this chapter, beginning in verse 20, he says, "When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken prisoners to all nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Now, 5 times Jesus predicts the fall of Jerusalem. Do you think this was important to him? Was it important that the people who were hearing him heard that he predicted Jerusalem would fall? So what was Jesus' record on his prediction? Those of you who have studied history know that the Romans tore down the temple in AD 70 as they came in with their great army to quash a Jewish revolt. Jesus' comment on this and his comment on the woman and the gifts and the prediction of this temple's destruction led some of the people in the crowd to begin to ask some questions. And the rest of the chapter, the rest of the sermon holds Jesus' response to the questions. First, he responds to questions about the end of the temple, but then he transitions and begins to talk about the end of time, or at least time as we know it. Now, truthfully, the destruction of the temple doesn't concern us greatly, other than as an historical fact. But Jesus' next coming and the end of time, as we know it, that Jesus' coming signals, that concerns us a great deal, whether we acknowledge that concern or try to ignore it. Throughout the New Testament, there's talk of Jesus coming. First, his coming as a Savior, then his coming again as King, as ruler, as judge. And both his first and his second coming are a fulfillment of a great deal of prophecy. So while the temple events may not concern us now, the events of AD 70 and the fall of the temple are a guarantee that the end also comes, since one set of events, the fall of the temple, according to Jesus, begins to picture the other events, the end of time as we know it. And Jesus, speaking of his return and the end of things that will signal, he notes that there would be cosmic signs that the Son of Man would be returning. He says the sun and the moon and the stars will be shaken, and the sea will roar and toss, signifying that the world will be in some sort of chaotic state, out of control. And so we hear of great cataclysmic events occurring, or we anticipate that they will be occurring, and they point out in glaring detail the need for redemption. We know that our world needs redemption, our soil needs redemption, our air, our water, but most of all, our souls need redemption. And as we see and hear of events, we have some choices to make. In the chaos of our culture, the temptation is to choose to escape. And there are many escape mechanisms. Jesus talks in verse 34, as he has told about the cataclysmic events happening, he says, as you anticipate this or as you see things happening, be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life. And that day will close on you suddenly like a trap. For it will come on all those who live on the face of the whole earth. Be always on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen, and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. Jesus warns as we anticipate the coming again, as we see chaos in our world, which may or may not signal the end, but as we deal with chaos, he warns us against trying to escape into some sort of temporary denial. Now, he speaks specifically of two things that both uses two terms that both involve escaping through heavy use of intoxicants, carousing and drunkenness. But then he speaks in general just about the anxieties of life, things that will take our minds off of the chaos of things that are around us. And temporary escape may sound good on the surface, but that escape, because it's temporary, means we return to the issue soon, and we often find that we're more unsettled than we were before we escaped. There's another problem with seeking to escape. Jeremiah pointed it out in the Advent devotions that I hope you're using. He wrote those. They're great guides to help us move through this Advent season. One of the problems with seeking to temporarily escape from the chaos around us, we may miss what the Spirit is doing in the midst of the chaos. Jesus speaks of the soon coming time of great confusion in the mighty Roman Empire that would come soon after his death. And that confusion would impact the Jews and also the Jewish followers of Jesus. And what does Jesus say to them? Among other things, he counsels them to watch for God in the midst of the chaos. If we focus too strongly on the confusion, or we focus on escaping the confusion, it limits our ability to see what God is doing, even in the chaos, or perhaps especially in the chaos. Jesus came the first time to bring redemption. What is God's purpose in Jesus coming the next time? Here's what Jesus said in Luke 21:28. Now, when these things began to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Jesus came the first time to bring redemption. Jesus tells us that redemption is the purpose of the Son of Man coming the next time. We all need redemption. And when we seek to escape chaos, whether it is through an intoxicant or through just getting focused on the anxiety-producing things around us, escape means we may miss redemption. We may miss the Redeemer. The hope of Jesus coming allows us to escape our hearts being weighed down in despair. He says, stand up and raise up your heads. We've seen people in despair stooped with heads down, weeping. And Jesus said, we do not have to take that posture. Raise your head in anticipation. Look toward the coming Redeemer. Well, when is He coming? I want to be sure I can start looking in time. Well, that's a good question. When is He coming? It's probably the wrong question, but it's a good question. What's the right question? Jesus tells us the right question is, am I ready? In verses 34 to 36, we've read, Jesus warned His disciples to be ready at all times. A believer may be able to anticipate the coming of the kingdom because of the signs, but it's possible to get so tangled with the affairs of life that some people will not be ready for kingdom when it comes. Unexpectedly, He says, and universally. And because of that problem, Jesus spoke strongly. Be careful and be always watching. Now, there's another escape mechanism, I think, sometimes in following Jesus' words to watch, but taking them to an inappropriate extreme. Some people use study and anticipation of the end as an escape from current responsibility. I was talking with someone a few years ago about environmental issues and how we are polluting our earth, and maybe we need to take some action as followers of Christ to be better stewards of the gift that God has given us. And this person said, well, I'm planning Jesus is going to come back before it becomes too much of a problem, so I'm not worried about it. And I just said quietly, believe it or not, quietly, well, what if He doesn't? Then what? One of Jesus' primary purposes here seems to be to warn against false notions about the end of the world. To some people, those terrible events as the destruction of Jerusalem, which took place in AD 70, indicated that the end was near. But it wasn't. At least not as we measure time. And in times of great difficulty, predictions about Jesus' return abound. You don't have to look far on cable television to find someone selling charts and books and CDs and DVDs that will give you the specific references for every historical event, whether it's China or Russia or the European Union, and how that plays into some sort of system of end times. But I believe here Jesus is saying, according to Luke's record, that the end of the world is not necessarily connected with any specific historical crisis like the fall of the temple. So when is He coming? What did Jesus say? Jesus didn't give an answer to the disciples about the time or the specific ways that this event would be signaled. Again and again, He refused to answer this kind of question. Instead, He warned His followers, be watching, be careful. Don't be misled by predictions that the time of the end is near. I gave you a quote in the notes that I really like and I think will settle us well on this. Dr. Talbert says, God is going to order the future in God's own way. Our predictions will not change God's plan. Now, obviously, there needs to be a word of warning while we think about not being too consumed with what may be, what can be. Some people live as if there is no tomorrow. They're only concerned about the present, acting as if there's nothing beyond life but food for the stomach and clothes for the body. Those folks forget that you cannot run away from God, to whom we're accountable for what we do in the present. We will be accountable into the future. So let me wrap it up. How do we always be on watch? Well, a couple of things, 3 things I'll suggest. One is easy to say, but it's hard to do. If we want to always be on the watch, habitually focus on Christ and Christ's work in your life, through your life, and around you in the larger world. You do this through your prayer life, through your Bible study, through self-examination, looking on a routine basis. How is God working in me? Through conversation with other Christians. How do they see God working in you and in the world around you? And how do you see God working in them? I'll suggest also another way to stay on the watch, and it may sound like an odd idea, but take appropriate advantage of persecution. Our immediate response with any kind of persecution, and let's face it, we don't face anything like the kind of persecution that believers do in other countries where they're arrested, lose their jobs, their homes, sometimes their lives because of taking a public confession of Christ. But we still get some pushback. And so the words about Jesus, about persecution, they relate to us as well. But Jesus said, view persecution as a time of witnessing, rather than just as a sign of the end. But he warns or cautions or gives hope. Don't be preoccupied about what you'll say in your witness when you're brought before persecutors. The Lord will give you your message. Be calm. Now, that's not an excuse for preachers and teachers not to prepare when we teach Sunday school or when we preach before other Christians. I really don't feel like this is a time of persecution. Maybe you do from me, but I don't feel like it's a time of persecution. So habitually focus on Christ, take appropriate advantage of persecution, and then pray for legitimate escape. And we know that the only legitimate escape, the ultimate escape, is through redemption. Being redeemed, Jesus says, means we can stand before the Son of Man. I learned about redemption as a young man. Janice and I had been dating for a while, and I realized we needed to be planning a wedding. She was not quite so sure of that event or that it would ever happen. But I was so sure that I went to see a friend of mine, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis is gone on to be with the Lord now, but he was, at that time, an older man. He was a jeweler, and he had an office or a shop in the second floor of a broken down old building in downtown Birmingham. I was working downtown. And I went to see Mr. Lewis and said, Mr. Lewis, I'm going to be giving this woman a diamond ring one day, and I want to go ahead and pick out a diamond and start paying for it. Some of you remember layaway. We didn't call it layaway, but that's what it was. And I picked it out. He helped me. And, 5 or 6 carat stones are hard to come by, but we were able to pick one out. And I picked it out, and then every pay period or so, I would go down and I'd make a payment on the diamond, but it stayed in his safe. Well, one day, good news came. She and I went, and she picked out the setting for the diamond. I said, you just pick out the ring. We'll get the diamond later. And then I went back with Mr. Lewis, and we got things worked out. And one day I went and made the last payment, and I redeemed that ring. And I got it out, and I'm happy to say she's still wearing it. There was only one payment required for our redemption, our salvation. It was a large payment. It was so large that none of us could pay it for ourselves. nor could we all get together and collectively pay it, even for one of us. But Jesus went to the cross, and he made that one payment for every one of us. The payment for our redemption, the payment to take us out of that vault in which we were locked because of our sin. And everyone who was willing to accept his redemption, his salvation in faith, Jesus redeemed. That's the point of Jesus' sermon I don't want you to miss. All the details and all the chaos and all the what ifs and the possibilities, they're important to talk about. But the most significant thing Jesus says here is stand tall and watch. Your redemption is drawing near. Friend, you can stand before Jesus if you've been redeemed. If you have come in faith to Jesus, you have been redeemed. Maybe today is the day of redemption for you. You've never acknowledged to yourself, to your God, to other people, that you want Jesus to be your Redeemer and that you're willing for Jesus to be your Lord. If you're willing to do that today, if you need to do that today, if you want to do that today, in a moment while we stand together and sing our song of commitment, will you come and tell me, I want Jesus to redeem me. In faith, I am accepting his gift of salvation. Or you may be one of the redeemed. And there's some way, somehow, you need to publicly share what Christ is doing in your life today. You come too while we sing our song of commitment. And we will share and celebrate with you your decisions. Let's move into our time of commitment with a moment of prayer. Loving God, thank you for sending Jesus. Thank you that Jesus obeyed your plan, worked your plan, and continues to work that plan by sitting at the right hand, your right hand, interceding for us, his followers. Now, Lord, if there is anyone in this room today who does not follow Christ, prompt him or her, prompt them to say yes to your offer of redemption today. May we all celebrate what you are doing in our lives now. We pray in the name of Christ. Amen.